The survival range didn't look dangerous from a distance, just a wide stretch of alien terrain under a pale red sky. But the moment the cadets stepped onto the soil, the ground pulsed beneath their boots, like something alive had exhaled. Heat rolled up from vents hidden under shifting crust, strange plants rattled as if warning intruders away, and the wind carried the smell of minerals no species could identify. The Academy called this place a training environment. Every cadet quickly understood the truth. It was a graveyard that simply hadn't been used yet. The instructor strode across the cracked surface and tapped a command into his wrist module. Instantly, the terrain responded. Sections of ground rose and fell, stone pillars emerged like teeth, and long shadows split the field as the light adjusted to mimic an approaching storm. Several cadets instinctively backed up. One activated his internal venom sacs by accident. Another whispered that the ground was vibrating in a rhythm suspiciously similar to a predator's hunt call. "Simple task," the instructor said, as if the world beneath them wasn't actively judging who deserved to live. "Build a shelter. No tools, no kits. Use what this land gives you." The aliens scattered with the desperation of prey animals. Some tried scanning minerals, others argued about what counted as stable ground, and a few immediately regretted ever applying to the Academy. Then the human stepped forward. No panic, no hesitation, no scanning devices. He just looked around once like a man taking inventory of a backyard he had known his whole life. Then he knelt, pressed his fingers lightly into the soil, and nodded to himself in a way that made several species deeply uncomfortable. He hadn't found a rock. He hadn't found a branch. He hadn't even moved more than a meter. But the instructor saw something in his expression, something that made him quietly check the emergency response beacon on his belt. Because the human's face said he wasn't wondering how to build a shelter. He was deciding which kind to build first. And the rest of the class hadn't even decided which direction to run. The alien cadets were already falling apart by the 6-minute mark. A pair of Solarian sisters stood near a mineral outcrop, both arguing in their native tongue over which of the local stones wouldn't dissolve on contact with their acidic skin secretions. Their argument escalated into detailed comparisons of silicate durability, pH thresholds, and something about calcium-binding enzymes that none of the other species could follow. Neither had touched a single rock. Nearby, a Virelian hovered several inches off the ground, scanning for low-density materials using telekinetic pulses. He had already exhausted himself once and was now nursing a headache. Tiny vessels near his temple had ruptured during the last wave of sensory strain. A thin trickle of blood was absorbed quickly by the micro-reactive band on his forehead, but he hadn't noticed how pale his skin had become. The med drone assigned to this session buzzed over him twice before backing off with a cautionary ping. Two Threxians, one bulky, the other taller with narrower forelimbs, argued loudly about load distribution. The heavier one was lifting massive slabs of hardened crust from the ground, while the other kept running off in circles to find structural supports they hadn't agreed on. The tall one tripped on a root and slammed a knee into a sharp outcrop. He hissed, muttering a curse. The med drone floated over and flashed a message on his wristband. Blunt trauma detected. Non-displaced patella contusion. Movement permitted. Avoid torsion. He grunted and limped away anyway. A Yvanari species with broad tentacle limbs was attempting to manipulate sticky mud near one of the steam vents, murmuring in delight until the mud began to tremble. Then it shifted. Then it opened something that was probably a mouth and hissed. The Yvanari squealed and retreated, 4 limbs flailing. His group marked off the entire quadrant as biohazardous ground and backed toward a slope that was slowly growing sharper with each temperature drop. And through all this, the human kept working. His name was Noah Mercer, no rank yet, no backstory volunteered. Just one of the few Earth applicants in the interspecies program, assigned to the survival cohort due to high functional marks and prior environmental adaptability. No one knew what that meant, but they were starting to get a good idea. He had moved maybe 10 meters from where he started. He had chosen the slight incline of a natural ridge that angled just away from the storm's likely path. No scanner, no measuring device. Just the sun, the wind, the smell of moisture in the air, and the way the ground dried in cracked spider webs beneath certain plants. Within minutes, he had selected branches from a wiry, flexible tree species the others had ignored. The leaves weren't broad enough to catch attention, but he noted the bark was both fibrous and heat-retentive when dry. He pulled only what he needed, trimming them with carefully snapped elbows, and stacked them neatly beside a section of angled stone. By the 12-minute mark, his first shelter was nearly complete. It was a lean-to with a shallow roof, angled perfectly with the wind. The sides were insulated with a layer of bark fiber packed against dense root moss he had gathered from the shadow side of a boulder. The inside wasn't tall, but it would retain heat and shield against the gusts. The branches were cross-braced, pressed into the ground using weighted fulcrums, not just laid across haphazardly. To most of the cadets, it looked like witchcraft. To the instructor, it looked like experience. The instructor didn't move. He simply recorded. Time to functional structure, 13M47S. Materials, local, unmodified. Form, Earth Standard Lean-To Shelter. Functionality, adequate for wind and temperature insulation. Noah Mercer stepped back from it, rubbed some dirt into his palms, and immediately turned toward the horizon. The wind had shifted. The clouds on the southern edge of the terrain had begun to bulge, gathering mass in uneven streaks. Most cadets hadn't noticed. Even the Threxians were still arguing over structural integrity for roofs they hadn't even begun to shape. But Noah Mercer had already picked up a new pile of stones and was stacking them intentionally this time. He was preparing for something. And it wasn't for them. It was for what was coming. One Threxian finally managed to lift a massive rock and turn triumphantly, holding it over his head with a roar. He had no idea what to do with it. He placed it gently on a patch of ground and stood back, as though waiting for someone else to tell him what to build around it. The rock stayed exactly where he left it. A Solarian nearby tried using heat to etch cuts into soft stone. The technique might have worked if she hadn't dripped sweat onto the block, which then began to sizzle and crack from chemical reaction. The rock split. Her shelter idea did the same. The Varelian collapsed again. Another attempt to levitate branches had strained his cranial focus. This time, the bleeding was more noticeable. The med drone circled in low and emitted a priority warning. Cerebral strain threshold reached. Neural focus prohibited for remainder of exercise. Recommend rest. The instructor did not intervene. He simply noted that the cadet had been removed from effective participation. Meanwhile, Mercer finished his second shelter. This one looked entirely different, shorter, tighter. The wall bracing had been driven deeper into the earth and held in place with rocks angled against each support. The entrance faced downwind. Moss lining was stacked higher at the base, angled for runoff. The center roof was bowed downward slightly, allowing wind to crest over instead of ripping into it. It was a storm shelter. He hadn't been told to build one, but he did. By the time most cadets had found something vaguely supportive to lean against, he had built two different shelters, both stable. And he wasn't done. The instructor looked toward the clouds again. Then back at the human who was now quietly collecting scent-masking foliage from around a plant whose pollen pods no other cadet had even dared approach. And in that moment, it became clear. Mercer wasn't building shelters. He was preparing for the worst-case scenario. By the 30-minute mark, most of the alien cadets had successfully located at least one material that might support part of a structure. A few had even begun shaping primitive frameworks. None had finished. None looked confident. A group of 4 stood in a tense circle near the southern ridge, arguing over how to reinforce a teardrop-shaped hut they had outlined with scratched lines in the dirt. The Virelian had drawn the diagram, but the Solarian pair refused to build without structural modeling. The Threxian assigned to lift base stones kept repositioning them every time someone changed the entrance orientation. They had achieved consensus on the shape only moments before the wind shifted and blew half their diagram away. Meanwhile, Mercer crouched near his third site. He hadn't said a word since the exercise began. Not a shout, not a grunt of effort, just motion. Quiet, efficient, practiced. His hands moved like someone who had done this many times in many places, each one more unforgiving than the last. The spot he'd selected was low, not the kind of place most species would choose. But Mercer had scanned the terrain with his eyes and seen what they didn't. A naturally hidden depression in the ground, shielded on 3 sides by slope and one by foliage that refracted light in a strange, colorless shimmer. The wind passed over the area without disturbing it. From a distance, it didn't look like shelter. It looked like nothing at all. He bent a cluster of thick, fibrous branches into a frame, forcing them into tension and anchoring them with root lashings. He weaved in thin, rubbery fronds, some of which excreted a faint musky oil that stained his sleeves. Mercer didn't flinch. He tore more from the plant and smeared it onto the entrance and interior lining. Nearby, 2 cadets wandered within 10 meters of him and didn't stop walking. They didn't see it. They walked right past the entrance, muttering about needing shade or elevation. One even commented on a smell in the air, but kept moving. Neither noticed the shelter. The structure blended so perfectly with the terrain that it may as well have been part of the planet itself. The instructor watched in silence. He hadn't given any guidelines for concealment, but Mercer had built it anyway. Inside, the sleeping surface was raised off the ground using a platform of flexible bark strips set over a lattice of curved branches. The interior walls were slightly angled narrow at the base, wider at the top, deflecting direct impacts. The entry tunnel was tight enough to restrict larger bodies. Sharp ridges of bark were carefully embedded into the sides, not to injure but to deter entry, and the scent, now heavier with crushed oil, was enough to mask anything biological. It was predator-resistant, and no one had told him predators existed on this range. He had assumed, because Earth had taught him to. The clouds over the southern ridgeline had grown darker, still far, but the air had changed. The temperature dropped slightly, but the wind rose with a pulsing rhythm that didn't match natural convection. The planet wasn't just windy, it was reactive. Cadets were only now starting to realize it. The Yvanari group had abandoned their mud structure after discovering the second batch of animated sludge. One of them had nearly lost a tentacle before a med drone froze the ground under it. She was resting now under a makeshift tarp made of woven plant matter that barely kept its shape. A scan showed minor tissue damage, minor hematoma, and an elevated inflammatory marker. Nothing critical, but enough that she wouldn't be using that limb properly for several days. The instructor logged the incident. No penalty, but no points awarded either. Several cadets now hovered near Mercer's storm shelter, not asking for help, just hovering. One Threxian stared at it for 5 minutes before asking aloud, "What species doctrine is that design based on?" Mercer looked up from where he was finishing the Predator Shelter's support node. "It's a blend," he said. "A blend of what?" "Earth, mostly. But I read a briefing once on Palavan outposts and storm bracing from Kralin Ridge. Their structures collapse if water isn't funneled right, so I used runoff angles from that design." The instructor raised his head at that. "And the anchoring?" The Threxian pressed. "Anchorings from high-wind shelters in the Mojave. Desert storms push harder than they look. Had to learn that when I was younger." The Threxian hesitated. "Your species trained you to do this?" "No," Mercer said. "They just left me outside a lot." He wasn't joking. The instructor wrote quietly on his wrist module. Shelter 3, Concealed Predator-Resistant Dwelling. Function, elevated sleep, restricted entrance, scent masking. Design, influence, multi-planet doctrine. Completion time, 39M12S. The first alien structure collapsed at 43 minutes. A dome assembled by 3 cadets finally sagged under its own weight after the central spine made from a damp root split from internal swelling. The Varelian tried to hold it aloft telekinetically again, despite previous warnings. He strained, holding the roof just long enough for the Solarian to crawl out. Then his concentration cracked. His knees buckled. He hit the ground with a soft thump. The Medrone responded immediately. This time, the scan confirmed. Syncope, oxygen desaturation, pulse irregularity. Cause, neural overstrain, orthostatic intolerance. Treatment, intravenous fluids, rest, photostim. Time to recovery, 4-6 hours. The Varelian didn't speak. He was breathing, but dazed. The instructors allowed 2 cadets to carry him to shade while his body was rehydrated through dermal pads. Mercer finished weaving a final patch of cover foliage onto his predator shelter. He looked toward the southern sky again. The clouds were wrong. Not just heavy. Not just dark. They tilted unnaturally with the wind shear, high turbulence forming inverted columns that danced along the ridgeline. He glanced at the instructor. The instructor gave no signal, but his hand hovered closer to his beacon. At 53 minutes, Mercer began gathering new materials again. "Are we still in the exam?" someone asked him, half joking. He didn't answer. He was looking at where the wind was curling dust into tight, funnel-like spirals. By the time the instructor announced that there were 5 minutes left in the exercise, most cadets had retreated to crouching positions near their half-built structures, or else huddled under shade coverings that would offer no protection from rain, wind, or predators. No two shelters looked the same. Most looked like they had already failed. Mercer stood alone in front of his storm shelter. His predator shelter was hidden, the lean-to still stood unshaken, and now he was watching the wind. A Yvanari cadet walked up, eyes squinting against the dirt in the air. "Why are you building another one?" Mercer didn't look away from the horizon. "Just in case." The cadet stared. "In case of what?" The instructor, standing nearby, answered for him. "In case the storm comes early." The cadet laughed nervously. "That's not scheduled to—" And then the wind shifted. A wall of turbulence swept over the ridge like someone had turned the sky inside out. The instructor's beacon lit up red. Alert. Weather front breach. Wind severity. Escalating. Shelter assessment underway. Non-stable cadets to evacuate to reinforce structure. The instructor turned toward the nearest stable shelter. Mercer was already waving cadets in. "Go. Get inside." One Solarian hesitated. "But is it designed for?" "It's not designed," Mercer said, pulling the entrance flap aside. "It's built." And one by one, they ducked inside as the sky began to roar. The storm did not arrive in gradual warning. It arrived, like something alive and already angry. Wind struck the valley like a closing jaw. The dust didn't blow so much as erupt, tearing sideways through half-built shelters and scattering every unanchored structure in a single, violent breath. The sky turned the color of old blood, and the first drop of rain hit the dirt with a sound like impact, not moisture. Most of the alien cadets didn't make it to cover on their own. Some were pulled by the arm, others yelled at and pushed in the right direction. A few stumbled blindly through wind shear and thermal recoil. It was Mercer who hauled the heaviest Threxian through the entrance of the storm shelter, his shoulders hunched under the larger cadet's full weight, both of them crawling the last meter as stones whipped through the air. Inside, it was dim and cramped. 12 cadets. One human. Not a word passed for the first 20 seconds. No one could hear anything over the outside roar. The storm shrieked against the reinforced roof. The structure groaned but held. One Threxian flinched at every vibration. A Solarian pressed herself as low to the ground as possible. The Varelian, still recovering from neural overstrain, sat with his head against the wall, eyes shut tight. A Yvanari with still wet tentacle burns shivered near the back. Her injury pad had been torn off during the sprint, and her limb was exposed to raw air. She was wheezing. Mercer knelt, checked her vitals, and retrieved a sealed strip of thermal bark from his jacket pocket. He hadn't used it yet. He wrapped it around the damaged tentacle, then used root fiber to hold it in place. "Will it hold?" one of the cadets whispered. "It'll regulate the temperature," he said. "Better than open skin." "No, I meant the shelter." Mercer looked up at the vibrating ceiling. "Yes." No elaboration. Just yes. Outside, the wind reached critical levels. The instructor remained on the field, barely sheltering behind a control obelisk partially buried into the rock. His own temporary structure, a reinforced Academy standard pod, had been buried under collapsed earth 10 minutes ago. He kept an eye on the signal beacon from Mercer's shelter. It was still green. His pad buzzed. Cadet shelter, status. Lean-to, intact. Storm shelter, active. Predator shelter, status, shielded. Cadet Mercer, position confirmed. Other cadets, grouped within Shelter 2. He blinked twice. 3 shelters. 3 entirely different designs. All still standing. He updated the entry manually. Shelter 2, now acting as primary storm protection for 12 cadets. Functionality, exceeds training standard. Design classification, field operational. Human cadet has surpassed safety threshold by 240%. Lightning arced through the sky and lit the terrain for one searing instant. For a split second, the third shelter, the one no one had noticed, flickered into visibility. Then darkness. Inside, the human adjusted the entrance covering again, reinforcing the anchor ties by pressing them into deeper angles in the wall. The wind continued to roar, but the noise inside remained tolerable. Enough to think, to breathe, enough to feel shame. "Why didn't we build something like this?" someone whispered. The room was too small for lies. "We didn't know how," one cadet answered quietly. "No," another said. "We didn't know what to build for." A pause. Mercer checked the walls, patted the corner, felt for any breach of airflow. The Threxian muttered, "You didn't even ask what kind of storm this was going to be." "I didn't need to," Mercer said, not turning. "But how? How did you know it would turn violent this fast?" Mercer finally looked at them. "You see clouds, I see decisions." They stared at him. "I see a slope that holds water and think about weight. I see branches and I think tensile strength. I see where the wind shifts and I think of collapse paths. I see quiet and I think, what would I not hear if something was coming?" He leaned back against the wall. "You all think the world waits to tell you what kind of problem it is." They didn't respond. He let the words sit there, then added, softer, "I assume it already wants me gone." By the time the storm died, half the exercise field had been rearranged. Several structures now existed only as scattered lines of debris. The only non-human shelter that still stood was a partial dome structure built under Mercer's guidance by a Solarian after the storm hit. She had been the only one to ask how. The instructor approached the storm shelter cautiously. Most structures that held through this kind of weather failed quietly after. But when he knelt and pulled aside the covering flap, 12 pairs of eyes blinked up at him. They were tired, filthy, but dry, breathing, alive. The med-drone confirmed 1 case of exposure-induced inflammation, 2 bruises, and 1 minor concussion sustained during panic prior to entry. No life-threatening injuries. The instructor did not smile. He simply made a note. Survival, confirmed. Casualties, 0. Human shelter used by 83% of test group. Shelter status, intact. Cadet status, stable. He stepped back. And that's when he saw Mercer walking to the far edge of the field again. Alone? "Where is he going?" one cadet asked from the shelter flap. The instructor didn't answer. Mercer knelt beside a rock, pulled a thick branch from beneath it. It had survived the wind. He turned it in his hands. The others watched as he began sketching something in the dirt. Another shelter. Not because he needed to. Not because he was told to. But because somewhere, in the back of his mind, the storm wasn't over. The sky had cleared, but the terrain hadn't settled. Pockets of steam rose from cracks that hadn't existed an hour ago. Stray gusts still whipped dust into the air. The once organized survival range now looked like a broken mosaic of failure and bare attempts. The few shelters left standing leaned awkwardly or sagged at the corners. All except 3. Mercer's lean-to stood exactly as it had been built, unchanged by the storm. The storm shelter, which had protected more than half the class, bore streaks of mud along its base but hadn't shifted an inch. And the predator shelter, still unseen by most, remained hidden behind foliage so effectively blended that even the instructor had to check his pad twice to confirm its location. But Mercer was already somewhere else. He crouched beside a boulder at the field's edge, marking patterns into the soil with a sharp stick, sketching frame joints and tension points. The design looked different again. Wider mouth, higher ceiling. An open front variant. Someone eventually realized it was for heat dispersal, not protection. It was a desert shelter. "Why is he still building?" one cadet muttered. "The storm's over." The instructor gave a glance. "Is it?" It wasn't sarcasm. It was experience. Because the storm might be over. But the test wasn't. The final exam score wasn't given aloud. That would have defeated the point. Instead, cadets were told to review their own shelters. They moved slowly, some limping, others rubbing sore joints or clutching minor injuries that hadn't seemed like much until the adrenaline wore off. One Solarian who had spent 40 minutes arguing over construction angles stood in front of what remained of her initial structure, a mound of half-melted stone supports and acid-pocked dirt. Next to it, Mercer's lean-to still whistled slightly in the breeze. Clean lines, stable roof, 0 collapse. The Solarian stared at it for a long time, then said under her breath, "He didn't build that for looks. He built it because it works," the Yvanari added behind her, tentacle freshly bandaged. The Virelian, now walking steadily again, added, "He built it fast." They all looked around. 3 different shelters, 3 completely distinct designs, 3 functional answers to 3 unasked questions. And Mercer? He'd never stopped to explain. Never asked for help. Never even looked surprised when the storm came early. The instructor reappeared beside the class, speaking only when they had all gathered. "None of you failed," he began. Some of the cadets looked relieved. Then he continued, "But most of you passed, because one of you prepared for more than one problem." They followed his gaze to Mercer, now tying together branches again, building something between a tripod and a frame. "Shelters," the instructor said, "are not structures, they are statements. They say, 'I am here, I will survive. This space is mine to rest, to recover, to plan.'" He paused. "You built shelters to check a requirement. He built shelters in case this exercise turned real." Then he walked toward the first shelter and ran his hand along the angled branchwork. "This one's designed to block wind and hold heat. Classic lean-to, Earth standard, executed perfectly, finished in under 14 minutes. He turned to the second. This one braced for storm shear, with runoff channels and wall anchoring, not just built, engineered, human survival doctrine. Then he walked, slowly, toward a cluster of vines on the far side of the field. The cadets followed hesitantly, even the Threxians lowering their posture as they moved. The instructor stopped beside the hidden predator shelter and pointed. No one spoke. He parted the foliage. Most of the cadets didn't even realize it was a shelter until he stepped inside. Raised floor. Tight crawl entry. Bark ridges lined the angled walls like claw deflectors. The scent was still faint but distinctive, crushed plant oils that masked mammalian biology. "This," he said from inside, "wasn't built for the weather." He stepped back out. It was built for something with teeth. That was the moment the shift happened. The cadets stopped thinking about what Mercer had built and started asking why. In the debrief tent, the instructor placed his tablet on the table and faced the assembled group. "Some of you noticed the shelters didn't match a single doctrine. That's because they weren't meant to." He gestured toward the display behind him. It showed side-by-side blueprints of 3 different worlds: desert colonies, storm-prone outposts, and predator-dense planets. Each was labeled with the planetary origin of its survival guide. Each matched one of Mercer's shelters. "He built based on instinct," the instructor said, "but his instinct comes from cultural saturation. His people evolved in a world that tried to kill them early and often. So, they learned not just to respond to danger, but to assume it would come before it showed itself." The Threxian raised a hand. "Is that why he didn't wait for the storm to start before reinforcing his shelter?" The instructor nodded. "He didn't wait, because the world doesn't wait." A pause. "And because on Earth, not preparing kills you faster than not acting?" The Varelian looked pale again. "But that means he assumed things none of us were taught to expect." "Correct," the instructor said, "and that's why you weren't building shelters." He tapped the table. "You were building comfort. Silence. You were designing ideas of safety. He was creating actual safety. There's a difference." A long silence followed. Then someone asked, "Did he pass?" The instructor tilted his head. "You think this was about passing?" He tapped his tablet again. "Noah Mercer finished 3 field-grade shelters before any of you identified usable cover. The storm shelter functioned beyond spec and protected over half the cadets. He also completed a concealed predator-resistant structure based on no prior scan data of the planet's fauna. And afterward, the display changed again. It showed Mercer's final design, the open front shelter he had sketched in the dirt. After all of that, he started building one more, a thermal dispersal shelter for high-heat post-storm sun exposure, a condition that wasn't even included in your test brief. He built it anyway, the instructor said, because he looked at the sky and assumed there was more. One Solarian finally muttered, "So what is the test then?" The instructor looked around the tent and said, "The test is whether you build for now." He turned the tablet off. "Or for what comes next." The exercise was over. The terrain had reset, as if the storm had never passed, as if the shelters had never stood. The soil no longer steamed. The wind no longer howled. On the surface, everything looked neutral again, sterile, even. But no one felt neutral anymore. Cadets filed out of the debrief tent slowly, quietly, not out of shame or fatigue, though both were present. There was a different weight now, an unspoken awareness that something fundamental had shifted not in the weather or in the test, but in what they understood about survival, about humans. Noah Mercer wasn't with them. He'd already returned to the edge of the range, where the debris from the broken shelters had been collected into a pile for disposal. He wasn't sorting through it. He wasn't reminiscing. He was repurposing. The instructor found him there, bare-sleeved, dirt-streaked, hauling stones and splintered wood into 2 stacks. Usable, not usable. Building another one? The instructor asked. Mercer looked up but didn't stop working. Figured I'd leave a reference. For the next group? You're not required to. I know. You already exceeded every metric. Then there's no pressure to stop. The instructor paused, then crossed his arms. Why did you build the predator shelter? Mercer took a moment before answering. Because I didn't know the local species, and if I didn't know, I had to assume one of them hunted. You didn't scan, you didn't even ask. Didn't need to. Explain. Mercer straightened, wiped a hand across his brow, and said, every place humans have ever called home, there was something that could kill them. A storm, a beast, a disease, another human. So, when we build shelter, we don't build it for what we've seen. He picked up a snapped length of wood, twisted the end free, and continued stacking. We build it for what we haven't seen yet, because if you wait until you know, it's already too late. The instructor studied him carefully. That's not a habit. That's a doctrine. Mercer nodded. It's not instinct to panic. It's instinct to prepare. The instructor's gaze drifted to the pile of leftover materials Mercer had already begun organizing into load-bearing shapes. You know, he said, most cadets learn to build shelters the way your people learn to pitch tents. Mercer gave a small, tired smile. Most humans pitch tents because they used to build shelters. He stood up straight now, brushing off his hands. My grandfather built a root cellar by hand. Took 2 weeks. He told me, shelter isn't for comfort. It's for waiting out what you never saw coming. The instructor said nothing. He didn't need to. Mercer turned, half expecting to be dismissed, but the instructor remained still, scanning the horizon. I've seen 1,000 species take this course, he said finally. And I've seen them all struggle when the storm hits, not because they're weak, not because they're slow, because they assume the world will follow a pattern. He nodded toward the crushed remains of other shelters. Most build for the first danger. Then he pointed to Mercer's lean-to. You built for the second, to the storm shelter, and the third, to the hidden predator shelter, and the one you couldn't name, the unfinished 4th shelter, a heat shield, open front, incomplete but unmistakable. Mercer didn't speak. The instructor tapped his wrist pad, but not to log an entry. This time, he opened the internal academy files reserved for curriculum design. He scrolled past decades of protocols, scanned through the survival modules, then paused. Previous doctrine measured effectiveness by endurance, he said. Then he added a new line. Revised standard. Shelter must reflect future risks, not present comfort. Survivability includes anticipation. Human methodology recommended for all species training. He confirmed the update, then turned to Mercer. You're dismissed, cadet, but if I were you, I'd stay near that pile. Mercer raised an eyebrow, expecting another storm. The instructor allowed the smallest of grins. No, but the next class arrives in the morning. He turned and walked away without another word. At 0600 the next day, a new group of cadets arrived at the survival range. They stepped cautiously onto the terrain, their boots sinking slightly into the dust-softened soil. The sky was calm, but already streaked with high-altitude striations, the kind that suggested a system change in the next cycle. They looked around, wide-eyed, whispering. At the edge of the field stood 4 structures. One lean-to, perfect and wind-cut. One storm shelter, braced and secure. One predator shelter, hidden so expertly it took a Varelian 10 minutes to locate. And one unfinished frame, open-faced, facing the morning sun. There were no names on them, no flags, no data plaques. Just function. One cadet pointed to them and asked the instructor, "Are we supposed to build something like those?" The instructor didn't answer immediately. He waited until they were all looking, then said no. He turned to face them fully. You're supposed to build something for what you haven't met yet." They blinked, confused. The instructor let the silence stretch, then gave the only explanation he needed. Humans don't build shelters, they build survival. And across the range, in the shadow of his own design, Noah Mercer was already gathering more bark. Not because anyone asked him to, not because there was another test, but because the sky was changing again, and that was enough.